Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of computational neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Alex.
And the topic for this episode is something like how important is learning? So we're going to be reading one paper in particular that really addresses that question. But first, I just want to point out that you may recognize Alex's voice from previous episodes, such as our episode on global science, as well as our episode that took place at the Computational Neuroscience Imbizo. Alex, would you like to further introduce yourself?
So I'm a PhD student at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit in London. And I am a fairly enthusiastic Twitter user, so you can find me on Twitter at @antro.
Great. Right, so for this topic of how important is learning, the main paper that we read is called A Critique of Pure Learning and What Artificial Neural Networks Can Learn from Animal Brains. And that's by Tony Zader, and that was recently published in Nature Communications. It previously came out as a preprint, and people talked about it a lot then, and then it more recently came out as an official publication. And then so on top of that, we read a few extra things to kind of help give us background knowledge in the topics that are discussed in this paper. One of those is called Weight Agnostic Neural Networks by Adam Geyer and David Ha, and that's also from 2019. I think that actually came out after Zader's paper, but it's an example of an artificial neural network that doesn't use learning in the traditional sense. So it relates to kind of this critique of learning and how important learning is. And then we also read Functional Brain Development in Humans, which is by Mark H. Johnson, and that was a Nature Reviews Neuroscience article from 2001, and that just gives a background into what human infants up to 2 years old, they focus on, learn in that time span, and how we can know if they're learning versus if certain things are innate.
Just to clarify, while there are a bunch of papers that have been using evolution lately for learning neural networks, this one very explicitly cites the Zader paper as either inspiration or kind of motivation.
That's the weight agnostic one, the machine learning one that we read. So I kind of want to start by just going through this review on human development, because that's not something that I knew much about. And it feels relevant to kind of understand that in order to understand critiques about how important learning is versus essentially the alternative is that most of what we can do comes from genetic encoding of neural architectures. Basically, in our genome, there is enough information to build a neural wiring diagram that can do pretty interesting things, and then kind of on top of that, there's some learning, but it's not super relevant to our core functions. That would be kind of the argument against learning as being really important, whereas obviously in the field of machine learning, given the name machine learning, learning is important. So most of the artificial neural networks today, they specify some architecture, so how the neurons are connected, but then on top of that, the major thing that makes those models good at any interesting task is that they learn. They change their weights between their artificial neurons. And so the question is that approach kind of reasonable given what we believe to be true about neuroscience, about organisms and how they develop, and also in the face of evolution, kind of what would we expect to be given to us through our genome automatically? So I guess one thing to start from in this review, and it's kind of a reason why I wanted to focus on a review that's about humans, is the fact that humans are kind of special in this sense of development. We have abnormally long developmental periods. People sometimes refer to like the first 3 months of life as the fourth trimester, because like an infant is like not an organism yet. It's like it doesn't do anything. It doesn't like it's you
like
can't
a very expressive vegetable.
Yes. Yeah, it's a potato. So they're not doing anything interesting. They're not really doing anything that we would consider intelligent, I don't think. That's not what you look to an infant when you're trying to model intelligence. So in that way, humans are actually kind of rare, because compared to a lot of other animals, even complex mammals, animals that can walk hours after they're born and are kind of hunting and catching prey months later, and just a much faster developmental trajectory happens in a lot of other mammals, and certainly a lot of insects or other animals like that. So we are kind of unique in that sense of being developmentally slow.
An interesting perspective that's not mentioned in any of these papers, if I remember correctly, but which I've heard quite often before, is this idea that one of the reasons we are so underdeveloped when we're born is actually got to do with the structure of the female cervix. So in becoming upright mammals, and like the female cervix had to become a lot narrower, but our brains grew really fast. And so we basically have to get out of the womb before our heads get too big. Otherwise, it gets complicated. So there's this perfect storm.
And it gets complicated, mean the rate of maternal mortality goes
through the roof, yeah.
Or, women just can't walk because they need to have huge,
Yeah, they need to have huge cervixes. So you kind of got like cervixes getting more narrow because you want to stand upright as a species, but cranium is getting bigger because we want to contain more brain volume. And so the solution was we'll get the baby out early. This is a theory I've heard postulated before, but it's kind of interesting because it doesn't say anything about learning. And then you wonder, is there an advantage to being out in the outside world and being exposed to stimuli from earlier on than...
Yeah, so I mean, and I think we'll get to these points, but there are at least two possibilities, right? So like one would be that there's a benefit to humans in particular for being in the world. They get to experience the statistics of the world. They get to hear what people are saying around them. They get to see what people are seeing around them, and they can basically pick up on these stimuli and learn a lot in a way that they wouldn't be able to do if they were just in the womb for that extra year or whatever. But the alternative, and this is at least hypothetically possible, more consistent with many other animals, would be that the first year out of the womb, babies learn almost nothing from stimuli. I mean, this is the extreme view, right? And instead, they're basically just developing almost deterministically in a way that could have happened in the womb. Again, there just wasn't like space for their brain to develop further. And in the extreme view, certain animals, certain very simple insects, for example, might be approximately deterministic, right? It might be the case that the genome, obviously the genome is responsible for constructing the body at a quite detailed level. I mean, there's sort of, the way the genome produces the body is somewhat well understood for some organisms. And you could imagine that the rules by which the brain develops and connects and wires up are encoded in some form in the genome. And basically all of the behavior that the animal can produce is a consequence of this sort of lawful, I'll use deterministic, it could be stochastic, but like approximately deterministic wiring of the brain as a consequence of its genetic code. And so the behaviors are not things that are learned at all, but they're like purely encoded in the genome, and therefore the conclusion, and this is what some of the discussion will center on, they're essentially evolved, right? Evolution acts on the genome, which acts on these deterministic behaviors. And in this sense, the difference between learning and evolution is not so clear. Evolution is merely what acts on the genome so there is still experience that takes place, but the learning happens kind of at the level of the genome.
I mean, I think that's a pretty big difference. Like, it's not hard to distinguish between learning and evolution in this sense. Learning is what happens in the individual organism's lifespan in response to its environment. And evolution is what happens when you have to survive and keep producing offspring over multiple generations.
Yeah, but stealing the punch a little bit from what we're going to get into, the sort of mathematical or algorithmic distinction between whether you call it learning or call it evolution is just like what flavor you want to sort of semantically label your algorithm with. In some sense, most of the algorithms amount to, like, whether you're doing like genetic algorithms or artificial evolution algorithms, or you're doing learning-based algorithms, it amounts to get some experience and update some weights. And you could view that as something that happens with the experience, like within a lifetime, or the experience being like amounting to a whole lifetime.
I think we should wait until we get into the machine learning side and how this relates to AI. And certainly within the context of biology, there's a clear difference between learning and evolution.
Agreed.
Although, just to throw a little sideboard in there, for any listeners, we're not going to talk about this tonight, but for any listeners who are interested, there is increasing information stacking up for the idea that learning during a lifetime of an animal goes right down to mRNA level. And the fact that your mRNA in neurons and other cells changes based on experience. And now people are even exploring mechanisms that they reckon bias your DNA in the way that it reproduces later on. So there is like good evidence harking back to quasi-Lamarckian theory. But I wouldn't go into that now. I'm just letting interested listeners know that that literature exists and you should look out for it. It's
so
cool.
Even in biology, there's a wrinkle in the distinction.
Yeah, there's a wrinkle.
But okay, yeah, getting back to human brain development. But I guess this is related to what Josh was initially saying, which is this idea that you could still, even if there are changes over time in an organism in its lifespan, that could still be purely the result of genetics. And he was using the word deterministic. I think you mean determined by genes and not influenced by the environment in that sense. So just because you see changes in skills or behavior over the lifespan of an organism doesn't necessarily mean that that is learning in the sense of changing your behavior in response to environmental inputs. It could be that the genes already prepackage that entire process and it's just playing out over time as the animal develops, in which case it would still be a genetic influence. It wouldn't be learning from the environment.
And we were having a sort of pre-conversation about this a little bit. And like an example that makes this clearer, because I think we hadn't really thought through this so much, would be something like puberty, right? It's the case that your genes clearly encode certain things that will happen, but they remain like essentially dormant for, 10 to 15 years or whatever. And this goes on further, right? We know that adults continue to develop in ways that are a consequence of their genes. Maybe male pattern baldness would be an example of this as well, or many other things. Certainly there are degenerative diseases that only kick in at a later stage of life. And there could be environmental factors that influence the emergence or activation of these genes. But you can at least imagine that in an extreme case, there are parts of this that are essentially dormant, but still let's say deterministic. So something like that a person will go through puberty, but there's a long delay from when they're born to when that kicks in. So the genetic factors can still determine something, even if it's not immediate. It doesn't have to be the case that once you're out in the world, everything is socially influenced.
Yeah, and it is the case. I now realize that this review on human development is mostly this kind of observational sense that at different ages, 4 months, 9 months, 1 year, babies have different tendencies and skills. And so most of those observations, those studies, don't actually do much to distinguish whether that was just a genetic program versus if that was actually environmentally influenced and learning in response to the environment. So I guess we can just briefly talk about a bit of the biology of brain development and then get into more of the cognitive things that review talks about, because that's kind of more directly related. They talk about how at birth, most of the neurons in the brain are kind of in the right place, like the neurons that are the hippocampus are there and different parts of cortex and all of that. And the subcortical areas, if you look at them, they look basically like their adult form. The different areas of subcortical regions and how they're laid out look mature, but the cortex is like very not mature at birth.
One of the things that I found really interesting, what they mentioned about postnatal development, was this idea that in the first several months, that's when the majority of myelination happens, which I found really interesting. Like the idea that you're born basically with, at least in the central nervous system, relatively little myelin, and we consider that like essential for the performance of mammalian brains.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. Yeah, so you don't have the covering that protects the neurons, but I guess they're also trying to make the claim a bit that the long-range connections aren't really even developed yet.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing, right? Is that like myelin is not just a question of protection, but it's essential for speed of action potential propagation, and a whole lot of theories have been proposed about the whole way that mammalian brains do coding is different because they use myelin, right? And this has all sorts of things. Individual action potentials are more likely to fail, but they can carry it faster over longer distances, etc., etc. So the idea that for the first however many months you can do what you need to do without that is interesting.
Well, you don't need to do much. You're a potato, remember?
Fair enough. You can be a cute potato for 3 months is impressive.
But yeah, so the long-range connections are definitely forming over like the first year or so, I think. So the other thing that they talk about is, so basically from birth to teenage years, the brain volume increases by 4 times. But you actually have most of your synapses and I think most of your neurons shortly after you're born. So volume of the brain isn't directly related to the number of neurons, at least, or the number of synapses. And this was something that I was confused. I originally learned about this when I was doing research for, I don't think I've said on this podcast that I'm writing a book. But I'm writing a book about computational neuroscience, a popular science book. But anyways, yeah. So I wanted to know, because people have said that the majority of the neurons peak after you're born. Like that's when you have your most neurons, a few months after you're born, and then they fall off because there's this pruning process where it's kind of like you save the neurons and the synapses, the connections that are most useful. But I think it's actually, what I realized in looking into this is that it's not actually clear when the amount of neurons peak. This one talks mostly about the number of synapses peaking after you're born, and I think it's harder to know for sure the number of neurons when those peak. But either way, like, your brain is kind of doing a lot more or has more stuff happening right after you're born, which maybe isn't very intuitive. It's like 150% of the synapses you'll have when you're an adult are there a few months after you're born. But I guess that also, to me, suggests that that is learning in response to the environment. Why are you overproducing synapses that you'll then prune if you're not overproducing them so that you can prune them to fit the environment the best?
Well, this might relate to something that they mentioned, and is this idea that when babies are performing certain tasks, you see activity in all sorts of parts of the brain. And then later on, when adults perform the same task, or more mature brains perform the same task, you see more concentrated activities. So a whole lot of areas that lit up earlier in like an fMRI study are no longer active later on. And it more kind of distills down to the areas that we associate with that task, whatever it is that we classically associate with that task. And so this might relate to this whole idea of pruning, in that by having everything wired up from the beginning and then exposing the network to stimuli, it can explore a really it can explore a very large space of possible dynamics in the network. And then as it starts to find out which dynamics are useful, it can get rid of the connections that it didn't need. But if it started without those connections, there's really no way to explore those dynamical paradigms. And there's evidence for this in like the neural network literature as well. People have done experiments where if you train a neural network in advance and then you start deleting all sorts of connections, it remains really fairly robust for quite a while in terms of performance, just losing a few percent. But if you deleted those connections in advance and tried to train and didn't allow it to learn them, it would be way, way harder to learn. So I wouldn't draw a one-to-one map there, but it's kind of intuitively got a similar flavor.
But yeah, so if it were the case that everything were genetically predetermined, you wouldn't have this need of having all the extra synapses that you then prune.
Sure, yeah. So this is bringing us into the kind of middle ground ideas that Josh was kind of suggesting at, the idea that, well, really what you maybe want the genetics to encode for is good kind of baseline priors in some sense. Like a good starting state is high connectivity and get rid of it later on, especially since your mom is mostly providing the energy at that stage to build everything in your brain. And this could make a lot of sense because, as we will get into later, the genome has a finite capacity, and this is an important concept.
Yeah, so one of the phrases that they use in this review is like born to learn, that you're born with certain biases, and some of them are on this like physical level, like you have extra synapses that you can then prune, but also in terms of behavior, like it is the case, they said even, an hour after a baby is born, that they preferentially look at face-like stimuli. And then the idea isn't that, their facial processing is like completely innate. The idea is that encourages them to look at face-like things and faces that will help them learn how to process faces. So it's like you have a slight bias in terms of what you want to encounter and engage with, and then that gives you like the training data to get better at processing those things.
So yeah, maybe it's worth mentioning. So this review that we're looking at, kind of they break it. He broadly separates current kind of thinking in developmental neuroscience to three models. The one being this maturational model, one being the interactive specialization, and the third being skill learning. And the idea is that each of these models or theories predicts different things for how developmental neuroscience should play out. And And of course, as always the case in biology, they all have some support and some counter arguments.
So do you want to quickly summarize like what each of the three models entails?
I can do my best. So the maturational model kind of takes the approach of, well, basically each region of the brain is already predisposed to do what it's going to be doing when you're an adult, and it's just a question of waiting until that section of the brain matures enough to come online. And I think one of the arguments would be that kind of subcortical areas are basically mature when you pop out. Cortex takes a little bit longer to mature, maybe from partially just from needing more time postnatally, but also maybe from a little bit of input from the environment. And once it is mature enough, then it starts to contribute to your performance or your behavior. The interactive specialization more argues that, well, all these regions exist, but your brain needs to work out or learn online how to wire them up correctly. And so it needs to work out how these different specialized regions should interact so as to get good behavioral performance. And the last one, the skill learning, I don't know if you guys can weigh in here. I didn't fully pass.
I didn't either. I kind of felt like they all ran together a bit in my mind.
So the skill learning one is a little bit weird because it kind of like, I get the impression that it kind of has the idea that you've got a bunch of different like blocks of RAM in your brain, if that makes sense, from different regions. And as you get exposed to different experiences, you're just like, okay, well, we'll use this region to learn this skill.
I mean, it certainly seems like they weren't all mutually exclusive. Like,
no, yeah.
You can learn to wire together while the areas are coming online. And,
sure,
and all
exactly.
Of that,
I mean, I think these are all kind of fairly softly argued models.
One thing that did stand out to me, and I don't remember which heading this was under, but this idea that you're switching from subcortical control to cortical control during maturation. And they point to, as support of this, the fact that adults with cortical damage can have behaviors that are reminiscent of infants in terms of the deficits that they have. So I thought that was interesting, and it's in line with the fact that in the anatomy, the subcortical regions appear fully developed at birth, whereas cortex doesn't. So it makes sense. And it's kind of aligned with this idea that we think of cortex as being more about being adaptive and learning and all of that, whereas subcortex is more associated with like innate quick responses.
Yeah, and there was this interesting, I mean, he didn't really cite a specific paper here, I don't think, but he argued this idea that visual tracking of moving stimuli is not smooth, but a series of separate refoveations. So this is basically saccades. But at around 1 month of age, infants go through a phase of sticky fixation, during which they have difficulty in shifting their gaze from one stimulus to another. And one argument for this is that this is the kind of key period at which cortex is starting to interfere with what was before a subcortically controlled behavior. And so you get this kind of conflict of control, and then eventually cortex kind of prevails.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that they said. If you are an adult with cortical damage, you also get that kind of sticky fixation, I think. So there were some things that do point more to the distinction between a genetic program that's playing out versus things that actually are about learning in response to the environment. One thing that was mentioned briefly that I don't actually know the details of, he said something about how premature babies allow you, obviously, to kind of differentiate between developmental age and time spent outside of the womb, like in the actual environment. So if you're born premature, now your time in the environment starts earlier. So it's possible that if things depend on you having exposure to the environment, that you would get those things earlier than if you were born at full term. And so he just makes reference to this as a way of studying it, and the fact that it does suggest that time in the environment is relevant for learning. Another thing that he is in one of these like side boxes in the paper is about babies born with cataracts, so they can't see properly, and what happens when you remove them. So it seems like when you remove the cataracts when they're older, usually still like children, but not infants, and it seems like immediately after you remove them, within a few hours, visual acuity has increased a lot. So that's kind of described as like latent acuity, like the ability to process things with acuity was there, but the inputs weren't coming in. And as soon as you remove the cataracts, you can now like activate that latent acuity processing.
For those of you who are not familiar with the term acuity, I wasn't, to be honest, default. That's basically within a few hours you get better at a vision test.
Yeah.
Recognizing the really small E far away on the wall.
Yeah.
You'd improve within hours.
And then they say, though, that there are still some visual tasks that they kind of never really get full capacity for.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. I wonder if it would be interesting to look at that timeline, whether they're comparing them to people of their same age or whether they're comparing them to individuals. If you took the removal of the cataract as day one of being able to see, and you looked at your development relative to somebody at the same time. But I suppose it must saturate, right?
Yeah, I think there's steady state comparisons probably.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting.
So yeah, that kind of points to both. There's some things that are just going to happen even if you're not getting the right inputs, and there are other things that actually do depend on getting the right inputs from the environment.
Yeah.
Do they say which things people have trouble with consistently?
I think they say that even after 9 years of not having cataracts, they still have some problem with face processing or something.
So kind of the second broad theory proposes this idea of the interactive specialization approach. And what I find interesting about that is that this is the argument that, well, it's not really the case that every part of the brain is pre-rigged to do what it's going to do, and it's just a matter of time until it matures. They're arguing more that initially stimuli coming into the brain are being distributed to all sorts of areas, and obviously there is some predetermined connectivity there already. And then over time, each area kind of condenses to becoming more efficient at some aspect of the task, and they work out their kind of interregional dependencies. And they argue that there's some recent evidence that indicates that the same behavior in infants and adults can be mediated by different structures and pathways. So basically, an infant performing some task and getting it vaguely right has, what I was saying earlier, different neural activity to an adult doing the same task. And just intuitively, this kind of agrees with me a lot more for the idea of why large networks are useful devices to learn with, right? The whole idea is to not have too much predetermined in who's going to do what in advance, because that is essentially constraining you.
Yeah, so I mean, you're articulating something which is consistent with the intuitions. Why are we even doing this episode? We're doing this episode because it is there's a contemporary moment where, perhaps prompted in part by this Zeta review, but some other ideas that have been floating around as well, that maybe innate stuff is more important. But of course, I would say the dominant narrative right now, and the one you're pointing to, is that learning is sufficient to do a lot. So I mean, in the Zeta paper, which we'll get to, but we probably won't cover all of the philosophical background, right? I mean, it's the case that people have been arguing for millennia about how much is innate versus learned. This is the nature-nurture divide. Zeta points to the distinction between Plato and Aristotle as being on the different teams, and in the 20th century, cognitivism versus certain forms of behaviorism kind of ended up being, to some extent, about how much are innate mechanisms versus how much is learned. So, I mean, there's this obviously this whole huge background, and it does feel like right now, with the excitement around neural networks and deep learning and contemporary AI approaches, which tend to be driven primarily in a data and experience dependent way, that learning's kind of winning, right? That's, I mean, I think the feeling that we might have right now, certainly if you're coming of age now, if you're doing a PhD in now or in recent years, excitement is on the learning side rather than the innate mechanism side. And I think kind of the context for this episode is, maybe we should pay a little bit more attention to innate mechanisms relative to learning. And the expectation might be, and people have talked about this in many ways, but the expectation might be that innate mechanisms will facilitate more efficient learning, right? So learning from scratch is very, very hard with an undifferentiated network. And so the idea is, how much of a prior do you have on your behavior? How much of an inductive bias do you have in terms of which cognitive strategies you use? So this is the kind of language that people use in different communities to talk about what is there innately versus what's learned. And in the extreme case, there are animals that are totally innate, is the claim, and there are maybe organisms like humans that are maybe mostly learned. But I think the claim is, in a lot of this works, that humans are not even mostly learned. You can see the how much is learned in humans because humans can do a lot, but so much of what humans are even predisposed to do, as this review would have us believe, is biased and structured by our genes that are reflected in sort of certain developmental trajectories. So that, I mean, obviously we kind of didn't fully get into that recap, but now having done that, it's like, yes, learning is probably very, very important, and that's, I think, what we all believe. But here we are now kind of arguing about that.
So we can just go into the Zader paper now.
Yeah, I just want to mention one thing. So related to this idea of that neural activity in infants doing whatever task seems to be fairly varied, and then it condenses and looks more similar to adults with time. Something really interesting they mentioned, is that, for example, with vocabulary exercises, they find that the difference between kind of inexperienced and experienced neural activity seems to converge around exposure to about 200 words, irrespective of maturational age. So that's kind of interesting. That's just telling you that all that matters is batch size.
Yeah. Well, that is, that is good evidence. That's a good way of testing if it's time versus exposure.
Yeah, versus exposure.
Normally, you can't really quantify exposure to the world or anything like that, or there's just not that much variability amongst people, such that you could observe differences in exposure to vision or something like that. So words are a good use of that.
Yeah, I mean, the skill learning hypothesis I didn't really get into, and to be honest, I didn't hold much water for me, so I don't really feel like we need to go through that in detail.
Okay, so then we can talk about the Zader paper and his arguments. I guess interestingly, one of the things off the bat, and this is something that people point to a lot with problems around current machine learning methods, is this idea of data and how do you quantify how much data a human is exposed to, because we know how much data it takes to train a neural network. It can take millions of images, or in this case, I think he talks about this visual question and answer system where you have to say something about an image, is the block in front of the circle or something like that. And so we can quantify data easily in the models, and then you compare it to some intuition about how much data humans are exposed to when they're young. And usually what people come down on is oh, well, we get way less data than what we use to train our models. And so therefore, the brain can't be doing this kind of learning because it would take way more data than the brain has access to by the time we're able to do the same task.
Yeah, so what I like about this paper is he does some of these back-of-the-envelope calculations in the text. And so it comes down to the idea that, if you compare a human to state-of-the-art image recognition models, you kind of need to be asking for a supervised example every second of your life, and
the first year of your life.
Yeah, and you probably still wouldn't get to the same number of samples. So you can kind of think of these as bounding arguments, but as he points out, to think of humans as supervised learning algorithms is probably a really bad place to start.
Supervised learning being the case where you do get an explicit answer or label to the thing that you're looking at, if someone followed you around and said the names of all the objects you looked at. So yeah, we don't think that that's happening. But the alternative, which is usually when you hear this argument about, oh, we don't get enough data to do the type of learning that we do, usually it's an argument for unsupervised learning, because that doesn't require these labels, and you can just kind of use your own experience to learn from. If you're looking at something and as you walk, you change your angle and you still see kind of the same object, that's more data that you can use to learn from. You can try to predict your own environment at the next time point and use that as a way to train yourself about, what are the objects in the world, and you can use how you interact with objects to learn about them and that kind of thing. So a lot of times people say, oh, if you don't have a lot of labeled data, you might still have a lot of unlabeled data, and you can use that.
And then you could do sort of semi-supervised or few-shot kind of learning where, for example, you've seen lots of things that look like dogs or quadrupedal mammals. You've seen foxes, you've seen raccoons, you've seen cats. And you see all of this, and you see a bunch of variations of all of these examples. And then finally you get to the point where you can actually ask a question and say, what's that called? And someone says, that's a dog. And you can generalize to other dogs because you've, having looked at all of these different examples, have a sense of what the clusters kind of are based on the structure of what animals exist based on what you've seen. And then you could say, oh, what's that? And someone says that's a fox. And now you kind of crudely know, well, the cluster of things that look like that are a fox, and the cluster of things that look like that are a dog. So you've seen many examples, but you've only had a very small number of labeled examples, and yet you could, generalize from that and correctly guess what other kinds of instances are when you see them.
Yeah, but there's interesting subtleties. So like what Grace was mentioning now, that if you are looking at an object and you move around it and you see it from a different perspective, and you can consider that in some sense a different sample of the same object, that actually requires certain priors to be in place. So it requires you to have some prior of the kind of consistency of space and the consistency of objects, and that it is still the same object, that has some intrinsic existence in space. And what was really interesting that we didn't actually mention in the review paper that we just said we'd put down is that the author says that this is actually what you experience with infants. So up to 3 months, infants show this kind of innate belief or this innate expectation for things to be spatially consistent. So if you, for example, show them a bar, let's say, like you show them a stick and the middle of the stick is blocked out by a piece of paper or whatever, and then you remove the piece of paper and it's actually 2 sticks, that there's a gap in between, they act surprised. Like they innately expected that stick to be consistent behind the piece of paper. And so they're gathering more information from the fact that you've now moved the paper than they would have if they didn't expect spatial consistency. But they don't necessarily expect temporal consistency. So if you put an object and you hide it, if you put an object on a table and they want that object and you cover it, and then I might get this wrong.
I think they just noticed that when you cover up the object, the infant stops like reaching for it or expressing interest in it, whereas an older child would know that it's still under there and still kind of ask for it. So when it's out of sight, it's out of mind. It's like, oh, you covered it up, it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So I think you're bringing up a very, very nice and relevant point, which is that, like, hypothetically, humans could have priors about space or about time that pre-exist our experience with space and time. And I think that's cool, and I mean, it's very plausible that this is innate. Though I will say, like, it does seem like when you probe an infant that's been around for a while, the fact that it simply notices that there's some conservation of certain properties of things, it's already had probably enough experience to get at that, right? Like, it isn't the case that in the daily visual scenes experienced by an infant, they'll have seen too many like things that violate physical intuitions.
Sure, I don't disagree with you.
I don't think that the evidence really points to that this is innate yet. I think it's clear that there is this development of when infants to young children kind of learn about certain kinds of things about the world. But the fact that some of them come later, the fact that certain of these like out of sight, out of mind things comes a bit later, this to me actually implies that it's very plausible that some of these sort of physical intuitions are in fact learned from unsupervised experience.
Yeah, maybe, but we're getting like, I think this is getting very technical in the sense that like to be able to efficiently learn multiple angles of impressions of a dog and put them in the same category, to use that information efficiently, I really have to have the prior that the dog is there. So I have to learn that not innate prior. I have to learn that prior belief. It's not truly
it's
a prior
like you
then.
need something. You need to bootstrap yourself up. You need bootstrap.
But the order is important right there, right?
Sure,
I have to learn like the spatial statistics and then apply that to these categories.
Yeah, and like it's not crazy to believe that genetics can encode some innate.
Yeah, I mean, if anything's been pretty consistent during the entire evolution of humans, it's space and time.
Yeah.
Like
gravity.
And objects are hard and etc. Yeah. So that is quite interesting. Yeah.
And so we are kind of using a lot of examples that are very perceptual, but I think that's actually in the Zader paper. He kind of wants to focus on perception and motor control as the examples of, what's something we can do really well that is potentially hard encoded, whereas the more cognitive tasks of reasoning and thinking that maybe traditionally people wanted to mimic with AI, that's kind of an add-on on top of this really core base of evolutionary relevant perceptual and motor skills.
But so in the review, they mentioned this idea that babies are kind of predisposedly sensitive to things in the environment that have facial-like structure, right? And this is really interesting because this would be a super useful prior if you're looking for if you're trying to do semi-supervised learning and you're like, where do I get my labels from? well, looking at the faces of other humans is a really good place to start getting labels from.
Oh,
right?
for other objects.
Exactly.
Not just for
Yeah.
faces.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, I'm in this environment now. What should I focus on more than other things? By having a bias towards focusing on other humans, this is, predisposing you to care about statistics of social dynamics.
Yes.
So this is, I think, quite a nice example of assuming that is innate or as predisposed to be innate. It would be a really good example of how you're not getting strictly supervised learning, but you're weighting certain samples more than others.
You're biasing your experience to collect certain samples and maybe upweighting them.
Throughout this perspective piece, I felt like at first a strong argument was being made towards genetic predisposition and not learning, and I didn't fully agree with it. And then immediately after, there'd be the paragraph with the reasonable caveats and the fact that it's probably, something in between or whatever like that. That's what I was feeling throughout. One of the things that was a relevant sticking point to me is that in the beginning, he starts out by kind of making this argument that we can focus on just trying to kind of replicate a mouse and understand how much a mouse learns versus what is innate, and use that as like a goal for AI, because current AI is much farther from a mouse than a mouse is from a human. And I was like, okay, yeah, I broadly agree with that. That's cool. So I'm cool with like focusing on understanding a mouse in kind of the place of a human. But then it felt like a lot of the arguments for innateness that came after that didn't apply to humans and would only apply to like mice or lower animals. Like he makes reference a lot to the fact like, well, how do we explain the fact that we can do so much at birth? And it's like, we can't, mice can. So that little like the focus switch at the beginning feels very relevant for kind of agreeing with a lot of the arguments that come later. Also, he makes reference to lifespan as a reason why you'd want things to be innate. Like if you don't have a lot of time to figure out what's going on in the world, then you just need to have built-in detectors. Like mice can respond immediately if there's a stimulus of like darkening that gets faster over them, because it's what like a bird of prey would make, like the shadow of a bird that was about to eat them. And so they have very innate responses to that. And again, all these things make sense when you are dealing with an animal with a very short lifespan that wouldn't have the time to learn some of these things. It would need to know them immediately. But it is possible, and that's why I wanted to read the review on human development, it is possible that humans are different or special in this way, this particular way of how much we learn versus how much is innate. And that's like something people talk about with respect to humans. Like we are a particularly adaptive species. We can like survive in multiple different environments and all these things.
But I still think like it's probably best to think of us lying on some type of continuum, right? And the continuum has got dots on it that exist right now. So humans are kind of the furthest along the line, and then chimpanzees are a little bit below us and stuff. And there's a continuum in between, but extant species only are at points on the continuum. And then there's a whole lot of dense points down near innateness, right? Around insects and all these types of things.
I think that there's a recognition that there's similarities across animals, and that you can look to an understanding of simpler animals to understand the evolutionary background for humans. I mean, humans are similar to rodents, and if we understand a lot about rodents, we'll understand a lot about at least parts of the developmental trajectory evolutionarily that led to humans, but we'll also understand perhaps about some of the structures that exist within human brains that still bear more similarity to rodents. So it doesn't, again, in this case, it too doesn't have to be an either or. It can be the case that we attempt to understand how humans learn flexibly on top of the innate mechanisms which are more similar to those which govern rodent behavior, for example.
Yeah, and in that way, like that ties in nicely with the focus on perceptual and motor tasks as opposed to the more kind of higher cognitive things that we associate more with humans. But even with motor tasks, we are slow to develop. So yeah, I just wonder, is this, like, there's a lot of ways where people talk like, oh, humans are special and that's why, we're like the dominant species and whatever. And it's just like, normally I'm like, no, you can use mice to study humans, it's fine. But it feels like of all the topics where maybe humans are a little special, this fact that we're so developmentally delayed could be one of them.
I see. I think that's where like it starts getting tricky, because so from the motor control point of view, we might seem developmentally delayed, but that might be because we're coming out the womb early. Right? It might be that if you could keep us in the oven for a little bit longer, by the time we came out, our motor control might actually be like reasonably good.
Yeah, that's a question.
And then the issue is like, oh, well, maybe the motor control predisposition was like fairly innate. I mean, people have also kind of argued that like motor control is is one where you don't need any labeled examples, in the sense that what you really want to do is you want to learn to control your muscles. And babies perform this thing called motor babble, where like from early on they're just flaying their limbs all over the show. It doesn't matter what they're doing in detail. The point is they just need to explore the entire space of possible muscle contractions. And while they're doing it, their hippocampus is learning a model of this motor control. And once you've got a good model in your hippocampus, then solving the control problem is easy, because I can explore, I can put inputs to my hippocampus, and on a per second basis I can predict where my limbs are going to be. And this is exactly what we see with motor control problems. People who've got compromised hippocampi are bad at this. I think, have I got the right brain part? Hippocampus?
Is it cerebellum?
Sorry, I apologize. Cerebellum. I suddenly clicked there. Cerebellum. People who've got compromised cerebella have problems with motor control, and particularly like fine motor control and reaching and all this type of stuff. So yeah, that's why I think the motor control is an interesting one, where I think that the idea that humans are born kind of, in inverted commas, useless is a bit deceptive.
Yeah, so we can talk about some examples that he gives about things that are innate, and he also gives some examples of part innate and part learned, which again is this more middle ground that kind of, as in all binarized scientific debates, the truth is probably in the middle. There was one example of innateness that I thought was particularly striking, which was these different types of burrowing mice that if you take like a offspring from one and have it raised by the other, it still does the same burrowing pattern as its genetic parents. Like this kind of complex behavior of the types of like nests and burrows that they build is clearly encoded in genetics, because you can completely remove the environment or change it, and they still do the same thing. So that was pretty interesting. That's a pretty complex behavior to be encoded. And then some of the things that are more blended when you get into like the neuroscience of it, he talks about, I don't know if I should say he or they, because the paper uses the royal we. But
let's use the both gender and quantity neutral they.
Okay. So they talk about place cells in the hippocampus that are innately predisposed to kind of form when you're placed in a new environment, but the exact configuration of how those place cells relate to the environment obviously is environmentally dependent. They match to fit the environment that you're put in. Also, he talks about this general notion that we seem predisposed to process faces, but then obviously the individual faces that you learn, the people that you can recognize, are very specific to you and learned. And then he also makes reference to this idea that we might have some innate architecture in our brain for processing languages, but then the specific language that you learn is specific to your environment. So this idea that, yeah, there's these predispositions, kind of this born to learn idea that the brain has some of these set up so that when you encounter the right kind of stimuli in your environment, these areas can be activated and utilized for that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I wouldn't phrase it as like activated, utilized. That kind of gives you the impression that you switch something on. More that those areas are predisposed to be really sensitive to data with certain statistics. And when that starts coming in, they really adapt very quickly. Their weights change very quickly. They condense very quickly. They've got the right time scales for their synaptic weight change and all this kind of thing. But there's an interesting kind of paragraph here that he lays out, which I think might be useful for some of the listeners, which is the idea that, so you have this trade-off between learning in inverted commas on evolutionary timescales and learning on the individual timescales. And he says, like, from the evolutionary point of view, the bottom line is that for the survival of a species, the species needs to each individual needs to solve what they call the 4 Fs: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating.
That bothered me. I assume it was a nature communications decision that the last one had to be mating and not the fourth F.
No, I mean, that's usually the joke.
That's the convention.
But, and sometimes people would say fornicating. That's the.
Oh, that is, yeah, that's a nice.
It's like that. Yeah. It's like that convention in physics. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it must be a photon. Have you heard of that one before?
No.
Okay, sorry. And basically he was saying that, like, you can imagine that if you have a species, like consider species X, that achieves 98% of its mature performance at birth, so it's basically all innate, but its competitor Y that functions only at 50% at birth, requiring a month of learning to achieve mature performance, all other things being equal, species X will outcompete Y because it can have shorter generation times, and because a larger fraction of individuals survive the first month. The catch then is that if something about the environment, some like significant big statistics change between one generation and the next, species X is going to get wiped out. So this is why pandas maybe aren't doing so well, and humans are. But the problem is, if you just phrase it that way, it sounds obvious that like learning is the best solution, right? Like definitely be more adaptive and definitely be a learning species. The problem is, if you're a learning species and you overfit or you condense on the wrong kind of stimuli as being important.
You mean if you encode genetically the wrong stimuli?
No. If you're a learning species.
If you're a learning species, right?
So if we distinguish between the species that are primarily innate and primarily learned, if you're a learning species and somehow you, in the course of your lifetime, do something problematic, you as an individual are kind of screwed.
But I thought the risk of overfitting came from evolution. You overfit to a past environment, and you have no mechanism for changing your behavior in light of a new environment.
Yeah. Okay. So that I suppose that can be argued the same way. But what I was trying to say is that it seems like if you're very innate and you're not very adaptive, and there's some significant change to the statistics from one generation to another, you're going to die out. And now you have no real way of getting around that. Maybe if you're really lucky, if a small percentage of you make it by and you have enough genetic variation, but you will be a different species after that. The argument is that if you are adaptive on the timescale of an individual generation, then even if there's a large change generation to generation, you will adapt, and that's fine. And this seems so you were surviving okay in the steady state dynamics of the environment, and now with big changes you survive as well. And what I'm trying to say is that could be an oversimplification. Because if you learn effectively on the order of an individual generation, you could also overfit, right, to certain incentives of that generation.
This is combining different types of evolution in a sense. I think the pure version of it is the learning species adapts in its own lifetime. Then a new one is born with a clean slate and adapts in its own lifetime. You're not passing on your biases that you learned in your lifetime to the next generation.
But there is species that are more flexible. I guess you would argue that they're more susceptible to social forces. If there's a rich community of humans already alive that can sort of play games in the world, change the dynamics of the world, then a new human will be born and play the games set up by the previous humans relatively well.
Yeah, but this seems very human specific. You could imagine creatures that are less social, but still an individual adapts a lot in its lifetime, and then they wouldn't be subject to this cultural evolution.
So I would argue you can't. Like, I do not think you can find an example out there of a species that we consider very intelligent and highly adaptive that is not a social species.
Octopus.
Okay, pretty intelligent from a problem-solving point of view.
I don't actually know much about their learning, but the fact that they can solve new problems.
Yeah, that is a very good counterexample, actually. And cuttlefish. But cuttlefish are quite social in some ways.
Yeah, I think octopus is
less social
than cuttlefish.
Yeah, maybe.
So I don't know.
Nice, Grace. Nice.
So do we want to talk about what all of this discussion of learning versus innateness should mean for artificial intelligence and quote-unquote machine learning researchers? I mean, basically, the idea is that in the genome of biological organisms, there are these very basic instructions that set up a network using, some specific connections are encoded, and in other cases, there's just kind of general rules about how to set up the connections from which you would then maybe do some refinement via learning. And so to translate that to AI, where it is the case the divide between learning and evolution is less clear because it's kind of all wrapped up into one, you're just given a data set and you try to do well on it, and you could imagine that that's because there were generations that had it, or that was just in response to that data set in that moment. I mean, basically, I feel like this doesn't actually, but from my perspective of what people in machine learning are focusing on, this doesn't actually require a big shift, because it's not the case that in AI, most researchers are building data sets. Like, they know that it's not about getting a bunch of data, ideally. Most people are trying to find better architectures and better learning rules. So I guess maybe the better learning rules, they would say, isn't that important. But clearly finding better architectures is kind of what they're saying is the goal.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of mixed feelings. I mean, I think this message is nice, and I overall found the paper to be interesting, and many parts of it resonated for me. But I don't feel like it's necessarily particularly timely for AI research, because I do feel like this is kind of well known within the field. People who are active AI researchers are aware of genetic algorithms or evolutionary algorithms. And I think it's mostly like an empirical finding how easy it is for practitioners to get things working, that learning algorithms, by which I mean like gradient-based methods, to train models tend to be more popular than evolutionary or genetic algorithms. I mean, if it were the case that evolutionary and genetic algorithms were more easy to use or could kind of obviously do more, then more researchers would, certainly more like people working on applications, would just be using them. It's kind of a practical sense in the fields. In some cases, you can get evolutionary algorithms to do things very nicely, and in many cases, you can get learning algorithms to do things very nicely. To me, the simplest way of thinking about it, which is not perfect for a reason I'll get to in a moment, but the simplest way is like, well, how much signal are you going to extract? And people assume you want to, from your data, extract more signal. And while there are ways of kind of getting around this, like roughly evolutionary algorithms are kind of like a zeroth order optimization, whereas gradient-based methods are like a first order optimization. You get the direction, when you use gradient-based methods, you get the direction of change that you need to make to your model in order to do better. And when you use evolutionary algorithms, you try perturbations to your model and see which ones are better. But it's sort of a less structured search. And there's even well-characterized regimes where one or the other might work better. One example where things could work better, so like depending on how many model parameters you have, you could be in a regime where one or the other works better. But it's also the case that if you really need to change the architecture itself, rather than just changing the parameter values in a model, then it's hard to do that using gradient-based methods, whereas you can do architecture search methods using evolutionary algorithms.
Yeah, basically where there's like good reasons why you don't have differentiability, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, right, if you're really trying to change like the number of neurons in your unit, or in your architecture, or the number of layers in your architecture, a lot of this kind of just goes under the guise of hyperparameter optimization in contemporary AI. So people will do searches over the number of layers or the wiring of certain macroscopic elements of an architecture, and then people will train each of those architectures and see which one's best, and slowly, kind of using not like natural selection, more like a domestic selection, decide to keep studying the variants of the architecture that are more productive when you apply learning rules to them. So in a sense, AI researchers are frequently doing something now already that resembles a hybrid approach between evolutionary stuff and specific learning. I don't think it's necessarily the case that everyone thinks about this explicitly, but I do think that most of the very good AI researchers today, I think, are very aware of this distinction and the fact that you would potentially want to use either or both methods in certain settings. And it's kind of just an empirical finding that learning is popular because it seems to work fairly well.
I think it's just worth pointing out, so one of the calculations Anthony Zader does in the paper, kind of back of the envelope, and I think is kind of widely accepted in biology, is the idea that if you actually quantify the amount of information that a human genome can hold, it's roughly 2 orders of magnitude short of what we kind of think we need as a minimum requirement to specify all the neuron connection strengths in a human brain, for example. And like that is a kind of very extreme calculation. You have to make all sorts of assumptions about like neural connection strengths being binary, etc., etc.
I thought it was 6 orders of magnitude less as well.
Yeah, maybe.
But these are all very rough.
Yeah, sorry, at least 6 orders of magnitude too small. Yeah. This is important, and it raises a really, really important question, because that assumes a kind of that's kind of an exact information theoretic calculation that assumes brains existing in a spherical vacuum kind of situation. Really, a really smart encoding would take advantage of the dynamics of the system the brain is going to grow in.
Yeah, I never am terribly convinced by these kinds of calculations.
Sure, but it's nice to have them as bounds, right?
Yeah.
I just like to have them as bounds. And then you can kind of ask the question of like, okay, well, if you know things about the natural environment, the statistics, you know what the temperature distribution is going to be like when you grow up. You know what kind of chemical signals are available easily and cheaply from the environment, etc., etc. How much information your mother's womb can supply, etc. Then you can kind of start to close that gap. And this is so why this is interesting, and it relates to the paper we are about to discuss. This idea of weight agnostic neural networks is because when they assess the performance of networks in that paper, they also consider the complexity required to describe the network. And this is in some sense related to the amount of information in the genome. So you want to select networks that have similar performance maybe on output, but then they are considered better if their cost for encoding is lower.
Yeah. Though he did notice that there are other animals that just have a much larger genome than humans. So it's possible to just increase the amount of encoding space if you really wanted to encode more innately.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. There's this like idea of, well, maybe by having a larger genome, it gives you more flexibility in the evolution optimization problem, right? That you can explore. Essentially, you've got a bigger library of potential kind of settings to explore from an evolutionary point of view. Any species that's been through a significant bottleneck at some point in its past, so some ancestor of yours got basically wiped out, you tend to have a much smaller genome left over after that. And so a lot of creatures that have remained essentially unvaried for millennia and haven't been through some type of selective bottleneck, they tend to just slowly accumulate, kind of by mutation, larger and larger genomes.
They use fish as an example of this. And I do think of fish as like large insects in terms of their abilities and how determined they are, which would be in line with this. It's like, oh, you want to be more complicated, but you still want to be completely innate, have a large genome.
But I think what I'm trying to argue is that the large genome wasn't actually something that they kind of evolved usefully. It's more a genetic drift phenomenon. And unless something comes and wipes half of them out and takes a lot of that genome with them,
you'll just keep building it. 'Cause
kind of, yeah.
But yeah, so we can speak briefly on the last paper that we should wrap up, because it does speak directly to this idea of what you can encode in weight structure alone and not actually doing learning. So just like what neuron connects to what neuron and not actually doing learning on what the strength of those connections are. So as we said, kind of the state of AI machine learning as it is already has a bit of this outer loop of evolution, either explicitly through algorithms that look for different architectures or implicitly by grad students who are trying to get state-of-the-art results on something, and they try a bunch of different architectures and then they do usually supervised learning on those architectures. That outer loop and inner loop kind of already exists, but you usually do have this inner loop where you do the learning on the architecture, whereas this paper is looking at what happens if you don't do the learning and you just set all the weights to the same value. I don't have much to say on this, just that it's interesting to try to see how well this could work. I think it's the case, I only skimmed this paper, I think it's the case that, they don't get particularly good performance through this method, which is not surprising. Maybe better than you'd expect for not setting the weights to anything useful. But still, it's clear that learning helps. So that's no surprise.
Yeah, I think how significant this paper seems to you depends on your intuitions. I think if you have a kind of already mixed view, this is consistent with that.
One of the things that kind of bothers me about this paper is they say, well, for example, our networks are fairly large. We have to sample weights because we're not going to learn them. So we have to sample initial weights. And sampling from very high dimensional spaces is a kind of complicated process in itself. And basically, if you assume any reasonable distribution, like a Gaussian distribution in these spaces, you're really going to sample a tiny, tiny volume of the space. And so they just make this more simple by making all the weights the same in the network and sampling from a discrete set of these fixed weights. All that really is fixing a very small prior in this high dimensional weight space. You're still in the high dimensional weight space. There's no way of avoiding that, right? And I think what was maybe more interesting from a biological point of view is that in biology, we see a lot of very consistent statistics across connectivity weights, across neural firing patterns, right? You have these exponential drop-off distributions, these power laws, for example, and this kind of thing. So maybe what you should really be asking is if you constrain to sampling from some distribution like that, right? Or sampling from only sparse sets in this weight space because connections are expensive or something like that, then how do you see these evolutionary... I just basically think there's smarter ways to do that would be more informative to do that sampling.
Yeah, it's kind of like randomness isn't just one thing. You still have choices to make when you are just kind of randomly
Yeah, exactly.
sampling.
And in high dimensions, that's really important.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And maybe that's what future work will be on if people find this approach valuable.
Maybe.
So do we have any final thoughts in general?
I think I would agree with Josh that I think this view is probably shared by almost all graying hair computational neuroscientists. Maybe the younger generation who've come to the field in the age of machine learning don't necessarily think of this. But if you're really interested in understanding biological systems, I think what Tony Zeta is trying to point out is that you must remember that you are not subject to the same goals and constraints necessarily as someone who's doing a AI or particularly AGI research. You do have to deal with all these evolutionary priors. You do have to deal with finite times and issues of access to sampling data, bad bandwidth basically of all your sensory systems, all this kind of stuff. Artificial intelligence researchers are looking for robust algorithms in the sense that we want algorithms that we know how to implement, we can apply to a fairly varied range of tasks, and they scale really well, all that kind of thing. But we're generally going to take this bunch of principles for building a system and we're going to apply it to a specific task, and we're going to train an agent or a model on that one task, and it's going to be really good at it, right? Human brains are arguably training on a bunch of tasks, or brains in general are training on a whole bunch of tasks in parallel, right? And they need to perform all of them reasonably well to get food. I suppose the good way is to characterize that as one big task, but AI is not doing that yet, and it's not clear that that's what they should be trying to do. So I do think, though, if you're interested in the biological question, I think it's a really big open question in computational neuroscience to get good arguments and good holds on the relative quantification of how much learning happens versus how much is kind of encoded innately. And I think it's a really hard problem that requires a lot of data to answer, but I think it's kind of fundamental if we really want to understand how our brains work as opposed to just building systems.
All right, till next time.
See ya.
Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.